The Starside Prophecy by Tirri. Read by the author. Chapter 17. Jim Elks. Jim Elks did not believe in any god of any kind, let alone the God with a capital G his wife was stupid enough to believe was real. Jim Elks had never been able to reconcile human suffering with the existence of a loving God, surely capable of ending it, but choosing not to. And if by some inexplicable occurrence did he come face to face with such a being after death, he would lodge a protest, that was for damn sure. "Well, that's all well and good, dear," said Joan, his wife, as she tied her apron, "but what exactly would you say?" Joan was shocked that her husband could be so irreverent and wasn't entirely sure she wanted to know the answer. "What would I say?" barked Jim. "What would I say? I'd look him directly in the eye and tell him to move over. There's a new captain on this ship. How about I tie a knot in his stupid beard before I put him in a chokehold?" Joan gasped while she frenetically rummaged around in the drawer in search of God knows what. As her hands moved around in the clutter, she vowed to petition for her husband's soul. "Forgive him, Father, for he knows not what he says," would soon be added to her stack of nighttime prayers. Melchizedek laughed when he heard Joan's plea. He sent out a message back to her to fear not, for her husband was cherished. But he could tell by the quality of her ongoing petitions that more mature ideas of spirit had not been established. Joan had always feared for her husband's soul, and probably would do so on her deathbed. It took time for a soul to realise that, although fear in the face of danger was useful if transmuted into evasive action, it had no spiritual benefit. Jim and Joan Elks were both younger souls Melchizedek had hand-picked to be a part of Sarah's life because he had deemed their input necessary for her psychological development. Their coming together had been written into the life plans of all three. Jim and his long-suffering wife had lived at Dodonol since the end of World War II, and although it was a bit run down, its shabbiness made everyone visiting feel at ease. The Aga in the gathering room was home to a permanently filled teapot, and all those who stopped by said that Joan Elks made the best cup of tea this side of the Mendips. It had been another long and boring day, and Jim Elks climbed into his bed, and his wife climbed into hers. An antiqued walnut nightstand separated them. It was 10:30, bedtime, which had been the case for the past 35 years. Jim took out his teeth and put them in the jar next to the lamp, which he turned off. With her nightlight still on, Joan was reading her Bible but felt too sleepy to really absorb the words of the psalmist. She could hear her husband's even breathing and hoped he wouldn't snore too much, but he was lying on his back, which was not a good beginning to what could be a long night. Joan put a bookmark in the page and set it down. She then switched off the lamp and began her nightly ritual. Every night she prayed to Jesus, and tonight she vowed to pray with more oomph. Her husband's soul was at stake. He really was a difficult man, so stubborn and so contrary. Why couldn't he just believe? Jim had not yet fallen asleep and opened one eye to look at his wife, who was curled on her side, eyes tightly closed and hands clasped together. He did love her, but she annoyed him, and the fact that she prayed for his soul every night was something he wished he would stop doing. He was born during the First World War, fought through the Second, and would take his chances if there was a third. No help necessary, thank you very much. Jim left his wife in the hands of the angels, who according to her kept everyone safe. He then turned over to face the window. Sleep overcame him 10 minutes later. In his dream, Jim was wearing an orange hat with a feather in it and cowboy boots, and as he passed a mirror, nothing about his appearance struck him as unusual. He was walking up the garden path, passing his wife's prized rose bushes, to the place that allowed him privacy and solitude. Jim opened his office door and walked to his desk. He immediately reached for a stack of photographs that he did not recognise. Jim sat down and began meticulously placing each one onto the pages of an enormously thick album. The album cover depicted a black sheep looking down upon a dark-haired, green-eyed girl. He felt a longing to rub the dark-haired, green-eyed girl's sad little face. The pile of photographs did not seem to be depleting, and in frustration Jim gave up and left them on the desk. He then made his way to his favourite armchair, where he spent hours puffing on his pipe. As he reached for his tobacco pouch, he looked up to see his wife push the door open with her foot. She was holding a tray of tea and a mauve quilt hung over her arm. Ignoring him as if she hadn't noticed him, Joan set the tea tray on the table next to her husband and then walked to the desk, keeping her back turned. She smiled when she saw the stack of photographs and quickly picked them up, wrapping them protectively in the mauve quilt. Joan then left the room without saying anything. She had in fact noticed her husband, but there wasn't much to say after spending so many years saying the same things. Jim shrugged and removed the tea cosy. After pouring the steaming liquid and adding 4 sugar cubes and a lot of milk, he began stuffing his pipe with a fresh mound of tobacco, but stopped when a rattling, which quickly turned violent, caused the cup to spill its contents. Alusha walked towards Jim's office, which sat under an old apple tree that miraculously still bore fruit. Alusha opened the door and closed it behind her. Jim was sitting in his favourite armchair in the corner. He was holding a pipe. The tea tray was now still. Alusha walked towards him and smiled. Jim's mouth fell open. Alusha leaned forward and gently removed the pipe from Jim's fingers, then began massaging the back of his hand. Jim was too overcome by the radiance of the beautiful being standing before him to think clearly. Alusha lowered her mouth to Jim's ear and began speaking her message into it. Over and over again she recited, "Look after Sarah. It's important. Look after Sarah." Alusha kissed Jim gently on the forehead before saying goodbye. Jim began moaning and brought his knees up in a sudden movement, and the covers fell away. His left arm flayed and the jar containing his teeth fell onto the floor. Joan, who had just fallen asleep, sat up with a start and switched on the light. "Are you okay, dear?" she asked. "Yes, dear, I'm very okay," was all her husband could say. Jim left his teeth on the floor, pulled the covers back up to his chin, and prayed to God for the first time in his life. "Please let her come back, God. Please."